So in this video, we're going to talk about radio buttons, how we can style them, how we can implement them, as well as the Quasar's way of creating your own radio buttons. Let's go! First, before we start using QRadio components, we need to first know what a QRadio component itself is, right? And how it is used in a context. So, for example, you have, let's say, a 4 set of choices. Let's say 4 types of colors, right? So red, blue, green, and yellow, for example. Now, you can only select one color. So in this case, what do you do? So this is where QRadio comes in. The QRadio component allows the user itself to make a single selection based on a set of items. In this case, the example we just provided earlier, right? We have 4 items and you can only select one color from that item, right? So now, in that scenario, you can see that the QRadio component itself is a perfect fit for that type of scenario. Now that we know how we can use a QRadio itself, let us now dive into the code itself and then try to implement it in our own way, right? So we're going to create our own QRadio. We're going to add some styles to it as well as to customize it a little, right? So in this example application, you can see that I have a blank app, right? So I have a simple text input and I also have a drop down. So in this case, we're going to add a QRadio component for selecting, let's say the sex, for example. So let's add the option to choose between male and female, right? So in order to implement that code itself or the component itself, we're going to add a QRadio to our code. So first and foremost, we need to add a separator for our code. So let's add a div, for example. So now that we have a div right here, we can now create our own QRadio inside of it. So let's see. So in order to create a QRadio, you need to simply add a Q-radio component, right? And then you're going to add a V model. Let's say, for now, let's leave it at blank because we don't know what V model we're going to use just yet. So next, now that we have a V model set and ready to go, we're going to create now our own V model in order to bind that to the component itself. So let's say, let's add a, so we have a text input here. We also have a colors. So in this example, let's add, let's say, sex, for example. And let's set it to, for example, male, let's say. So now we have a V model, right? So we're going to add this exact V model, which is this one, and then we're going to append it right here, like this one. And then once we have that already, we're going to set a value for this one. So let's set it to val, right? So the val is the syntax for creating a, or for setting a value. So let's say, so it's in white. So let's add the form data. Yeah, so it's structured like that because as you can see, we have a form data right here. And the option itself, or rather the V model, is found inside the form data. So now that we have that, rather we have binded the V model, the next step is we need to add a value to it. So for the value, we're going to add, let's say, something like this. So let's say like that. So, or maybe, yeah. Just for the sake of example, let's just use the string to make it simple, right? Now that we have the value, we can now add the label itself. So let's add a label. Let's say, let's add the male. So now that we have that ready, if you take a look at our code right here, you can now see that we have a QRadio right exactly here. So we have the male option pre-selected. Why? Because as you can see here, in our option, or rather in our V model, we have bound this exact value to this value at the top. Remember, the value of the vModel depends on the value declared on the QRadio itself. Again, to emphasize, the value of the vModel, in this case the form data, will depend on the value set in the component itself, which is the QRadio. So please do bear that in mind. Going back, now that we have the QRadio set and ready to go, we're going to add now another option. So let's just simply duplicate the code above. So in this case, let's just copy it. So let's see. So we have the same vModel. So going to use the same vModel. And we have the same, or rather a different value. So in this case, female. And then we're going to add a different label. So let's add here female. So you will notice that in our code, the QRadio has the same vModel, right? The reason being is that whatever QRadio component you click between these two options right here will be the value of the vModel. So if you take a look at our code, in this case, to give you an example, let's preview what the vModel actually is. So in this case, I'm going to show you exactly what the vModel contains as is. So let's add the form data that says. So here, what we're doing is we're rendering the actual value, right? So if we go back in our application, the moment I click this, you'll see that the value right here changes, right? So if I click the male, the vModel changes as well. So that is the reason why the vModel of a QRadio must be the same across all of the components. Reason being is that if you click if whatever QRadio bot or QRadio component you click, whatever value it contains will be the value of the vModel itself. So that is how you implement a basic setup for a QRadio. So we're going to add some little bit of spice to it. So let's make things a little bit more presentable in a sense. So in order to do that, let's remove this rendering for a while. And then let's add a text, let's say something like this. So let's add a div, for example. Or let's say, not div, but rather span. So something like that. So if we go back in our application, as you can see, now we have a much more defined UI, right? So as you can see, you can choose either male or female, but you can never choose both, right? So it's just one example of implementing a Quasar radio. Now that we have a basic example of a Quasar radio, we can now try styling it in a sense, right? So one way that we can style it is by adding a dense property. So the dense property basically allows the component to compress its spacings inside the elements. So to demonstrate, as you can see right here, let's add a dense property. Dense, something like that. So as you can see right here, the components themselves are kind of stuck together, right? So if you take a look at this part of the screen, there's no spacing in between the male and the female QRadio element. It's because of the dense property. But if you take a look at this, as soon as I remove this, or as soon as I remove the dense property, the spacing is now much better to look at, and there is now spaces in between elements, right? So as you can see here, there's a bit of spacing between the male and the female choice, right? One way of styling the components themselves is by adding what they call a color. So in a sense, you can change the color of the Quasar radio itself. Let's say you want it to be a red or, for example, green. So in Quasar, it is possible to add styles to your radio buttons. So in order to do just that, we simply need to head over to our code, and then we need to add some code to it. So in this case, let's say you have this current code, right? So we need, in order to add a custom color, or let's say you want to make the colors a bit more colorful in a sense, so you simply need to add a color property to your element, and then you simply choose a color. So for the male, let's say, for the sake of examples, let's say red, something like that. So, and then for the female, let's say another color, let's set it to, for example, let's say orange. Just, just for the sake of examples. So once we do that, as you can see, in our example, the female radio button is colored orange, as you can see right here. And the male radio button is colored red. So that is one way of adding color to your Quasar radio buttons. So it's not just, it's not just stuck anymore in that black circle thing, So what do you call this? Typically Quasar radio buttons are stuck in the black circle thing, right? So you can imagine a typical radio button to be a black circle and then a black dot inside of it to indicate it's a selected option. So in this case, Quasar allows you to add some bit of semblance of colors in your QRadio elements. So it makes the elements much more presentable and much more pleasing to the eyes, right? So now that we have that, you can also add let's say a dark. For example, you want the QRadio element to be visible in dark mode. So you can set that as well. So in this case, you simply need to add a dark. You simply need to add this element right here, or this property rather. And then once we do that, as you can see, it is not visible like this one, right? That is because the radio buttons itself is colored white, because on a dark mode, or when your application is in dark mode, usually the background is in a dark color. So in order for the element to be visible, it needs a whiter color. So in this case, which is in the Quasar's case, what happens is the element itself contains a white, the white color. So the radio button itself is colored white. Aside from the dark mode, you can also set it to disabled. So you can disable the radio button itself by simply adding a disable property. So disable. So something like this. So once we do that, as you can see, I cannot click anymore. So something like that. So you can also disable your radio buttons. There are instances where the disabling of a QRadio button is applicable. So in the case of, let's say, you want to disable the selection of the QRadio first because you're loading, let's say, some data or some processing is happening, then you can disable your QRadio in this manner by simply setting the disable property. So aside from the disable, let's remove that for now, like this one. So it's now enabled. So aside from disabling the radio button itself, as you will notice, the labels are on the right side, right? So they're on the right side. So we can change that to display the labels itself on the left side. So how do we do that? You can you can implement that type of that kind of functionality or design by simply adding a left label. So by adding that property, the label itself is going to be displayed in the left side. So left label. So once you do that, what's going to happen is, as you can see, the label is now positioned on the left side. So you might ask, what are the instances that this type of property is useful? So in case, let's say your website is a right to left type of website, this kind of alignment is a useful feature for implementing that kind of style, because there are some websites that are aligned from the right to the left. So this property helps you to achieve just that. So aside from having the label on the left side, you can also adjust the sizes of your radio buttons. So how do you set the size itself? Well, you need to simply add the size property by simply typing so let's remove this first. So something like this. So in order to set the size of an element, you need to simply type size, which is this property, as you can see, this property, and then you need to add the size that you want to use. So in this case, there are 5 types of sizes. You have the XS, you have the SM, you have the MD, the LG, and lastly the XL. So these are acronyms for small or extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large. So to demonstrate, let's try each of those items. So let's say you have a XS size. What you're going to get is something like this, a very small QRadio button. So let's say you want SM, for example. It's going to get a little bit bigger. And then let's say you set it to MD. What you're going to get is this one. So it's a lot bigger and a lot larger, right? So let's say you want it to set to, let's say LG, for example. Let's say LG, for example. You're going to get this one, which is kind of big in a sense. And then lastly, we can try XL. Just to demonstrate, you're going to get a very big radio button. So just for the sake of example, let's remove this for now. So that is one of the ways that you can set the size of your QRadio buttons. So aside from that, you can also use your QRadio in combination with QItems. So how do you implement something like that? In order to implement a QItem in combination with QRadio, what we need is to first add a QList. So we're going to create a QList, right? So what do you call this? So initially we have a QRadio component. So in this case, in order to implement that type of option, we need to add a QList. Something like this, right? And then we're going to add a QItem. Now that we have a QItem, we're going to add a QItem section. And then we're going to set it to the avatar type. So we have an item section that is meant for the avatar. Now, you will notice that we are inside a QList, right? So what we're going to do is to simply move this element from the outside to the inside, meaning we're going to put it inside the item section, specifically the avatar section. So once we do that, we can now add another QItem section. So let's add a QItem label. So let's say mail, for example. So in this case, we don't need the label anymore for the original component because we now have an item label inside the QList. So let's see. Okay, so now that we have that, we need to simply duplicate it for the other QRadio to be inserted. So let's add another item, and then we're going to add another item section, which is again in avatar mode. And then we're going to move the QRadio element inside of it. So let's move this right here. And then next, we're going to add another QItem section. So let's say section. So like that. And then we're going to add, let's say, female, for example. So now we have a QRadio which is rendered using a QList. So if you take a look at our application, it now looks something like this. So you can choose between male and female. So in the case of, let's say, you want to add more descriptive text, you can do that as well. So you simply need to add a QItem label and then you add a caption. So in this case, you add the caption property. So for example, this is a sample caption. And then let's copy it over to the other item element. And then you're going to get something like this. So in this example, it's a bit jangly or it's a bit messy. So let's fix that. It can be fixed. So the item label, where is it? Yes, found it. So you have a QItem label. So we move the text inside of this one and then we move the label beside it. So once you have that, let's just fix it a bit. So what you're going to get is something like this. So if you take a look at the code, it looks really nice. So you have an option, or rather you have a QRadio with a label and a caption below the label. So let's say you want to implement a sort of allow the user to select one item out of 4 and you want to add some descriptive text to it. So this is one of the implementations that you can use in order to achieve just that. So guys, do you have any questions so far? Please don't hesitate to leave a comment. So any comments that you have will be answered by us, including me, and we will answer your questions directly. So if you have any troubles or you have difficulties implementing these types of code or these implementations, please feel free to leave a comment. So please don't hesitate. So going back, now that we have a QRadio implemented with the QList component rather, so we did a QRadio, right? So inside the QItem and a QList component. So we combine different components with each other. So that is one of the capabilities of the Quasar in terms of radio buttons. Now, let's say you want to implement a QRadio, but let's say you want to implement a QRadio component, right? But in this case, you want it to be completely native. So how do you achieve something like that? In order to implement that type of scenario, in the case of, let's say, you need to set a completely native form submit, for example, what you need to do is you need to simply add this QForm tag, right, at the very top. So in order to, again, so going back, in order to create a form in a native way, you need to create first a form tag, right? So in Quasar's equivalent, it would be the QForm, which is, as you can see, it's right here at the top. So once you have that QForm, you need to fire a submit event. So in this case, we have the submit form function in order to handle the submit event. So now that we have that, we basically have a basic or a native implementation of a Quasar, the Quasar form. So it's as native as it gets. So in order to submit your form, you need to add a type of submit button. So in this case, we have a Q button which has the type of submit. So again, going back, in order to create a native form, which is, let's say you want to create it in as native way as possible, first you need to add a submit, or rather a, not submit, but rather a QForm tag. So in this case, you have the QForm component. Next, you're going to add your input items, let's say the input or the radio button in our example right here, or the select for the sake of example. So once you have your items prepped up and ready, you need to add now lastly the Q button, which is this element right here. So you need to add a Q button with a type of submit. Also, since we have a button that has the type of submit, you need to add a submit function in your Q form in order to handle your form event. Thank you guys for watching this tutorial video. I hope you have learned something from it, as well as you have learned how to create your own Quasar radio buttons. In case you have questions or further clarifications, or you want to clarify something, or you have difficulties in implementing this radio button component, please don't hesitate to leave a comment down below. Also, if you like this video or you see that this has helped you in any form or any matter, please don't hesitate to leave a like as well as to hit that subscribe button. It helps us a lot in making you much more better content. So, this is Joshua from Pixelate. See you later, Pixelators!